Well, hello once again, my friends, and welcome back to GB 102 Bible Backgrounds. In this lecture, we're going to be presenting Israel's neighbors to the east, and by that we mean the Transjordan, or the eastern and southern sides of the Jordan or Great Rift valleys. And specifically, we're going to look at three particular cultures: the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites. And what is going to set these groups apart is that, unlike the Canaanites, all three of these groups are related to the Israelites by blood. That they will have some kind of family relation to Abraham, and thus have more in common with the Israelites than the Israelites would probably have liked to admit. And what that's going to mean is that these groups that we're going to look at had somewhat complicated relationships with the Israelites. That there is not going to be a standing order to kill and destroy or to go to war every time you find one. And so when we look at all three of these groups, there's going to be a certain amount of resistance and warfare, but there's also going to be a certain amount of respect and, dare I say it, friendship from time to time between these groups. So, if y'all are ready to begin, let's buckle down and let's go explore Israel's eastern neighbors on the other side of the Jordan River. So, let's begin in the far south and talk about the Edomites. The Edomites trace their lineage back to Esau. As you will probably remember from the book of Genesis, there is Abraham, who is the patriarch and the father of the faith, and Abraham has a son named Isaac. But Isaac will have two children, twins in fact. One is named Esau, the other is named Jacob. And Esau is going to be the older brother, and he is going to be finding himself in nearly constant competition with his younger brother, Jacob. And this is going to be important because Esau and his family descendants are going to be probably the closest blood link that the Israelites are going to be able to find concerning the promises of Abraham. Now, in case you've forgotten, the story goes somewhat like this. In Genesis 25, we find that Esau comes in from a field from a hard day of hunting, and his brother is already cooking a red stew. And Esau is going to come up to his brother and say, "Hey, could I get some of that stew? I am starving." And his brother, being a kind of crafty and shifty individual, is going to tell his brother, "Yeah, you can have some, but I want something in return. I want your birthright." Now, if you remember, Abraham has been given a promise that through his descendants, the earth will be blessed. That literally the birthright Jacob is asking Esau for at this moment is to literally have the transfer of that blessing from firstborn to secondborn. And Esau is going to, as the scriptural texts say, he's going to despise his birthright. That he is going to say, "Look, what good is my birthright going to do me if I'm about to starve to death?" Now, of course, reading in between the lines, we would notice that the joke is, he's not starving to death. He is simply hungry. And that this trade means that the blessings of Abraham are worth a common meal to Esau. But as we looked at earlier when we discussed patriarchy, we noted that the father's blessing is extremely important as well. And so when Isaac is growing old and he is getting close to death, he is going to call his children before him, and he is going to ask that they be blessed. And specifically, he has a plan to bless his oldest son, Esau. And his Esau's mother, Rebekah, is going to favor her younger son, Jacob, and she is going to tell Jacob to dress up like Esau and to impersonate him because his father is almost blind, and that they figure out a way to get their father to bless Jacob under the pretense that he is blessing Esau. And so he will dress up like Esau. He'll put on Esau's clothes. Long story short, he is going to pull off a fairly gutsy, but at the same time, a lie. And once he pulls this lie off, his father is going to be convinced that he is blessing Esau and not Jacob. And the nature of the blessing is quite interesting. He is going to tell Jacob this. He's going to say, "May God give you the dew of the sky and the riches of the earth and the plenty of grain and new wine. May the people serve you and nations bow down to you. You will be lord over your brothers, and of the sons of your mother, they will bow down to you. Now those who curse you will be cursed, and those who bless you will be blessed." And the sum total of this is that Isaac is going to bless his son Jacob with the better inheritance. And we know it's a better inheritance because a couple of verses later, Esau will come up and he will also demand a blessing once he realizes the jig is up. And so when Esau asks for the blessing, he is going to specifically say, "Father, do you only have one blessing for me? Bless me too." And he's going to weep loudly because he realizes that now his brother has gotten advantage of him a second time. And he now has both the blessings of Abraham and the blessings of his father, which, as we could tell, the blessings of his father are made specifically for material and land blessings, that he is giving him better places to live, more fertile places to live. And so here is the second blessing Isaac gives out. And he says this to Esau. He says, "Indeed, your home will be away from the riches of the earth and away from the dew of the sky above. You will live by the sword and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will tear from off your neck his yoke." And this is often seen as a very prophetic statement, that the traditional land of Esau is to the far south. So like the Negev, it's not going to be a very fertile place. Like the areas in the midst of a rain shadow, it's not going to receive a lot of moisture. It's not going to be a place that rains all that frequently. And so in many ways, Isaac is consigning his son Esau to living in a fairly barren steppe area of the Levant. And whether this is simply prophetic and this is how it turns out, or whether Esau is abiding by this, I'm not sure. But the result is going to be the same, that the land of the Edomites is going to be in a fairly desolate area, and its primary thing keeping it alive is going to be trade through the area. Several major routes heading to Arabia, to Media, and even to Damascus will go through this area. And so they will basically be established as a place where trade happens, but not necessarily a place where great agriculture happens. And so this is where we find Esau. Genesis chapter 36 describes it like this. It says, quote, "Esau took his wives and his sons and his daughters and all the people of his household, the livestock and the animals, and all of his possessions that he had acquired in the land of Canaan, and he went to a land some distance away from Jacob, his brother, because they had too many possessions to be able to stay together in the land where they had settled, because the land was not able to support both of their sets of livestock. And so Esau, who is known as Edom, lived in the hill country of Seir. And this is the high mountainous plateau that we'll look at next lecture, down to the very south end of our map. It's the area that's above 4,000 feet in elevation and south of a place known as the Wadi Zered. And again, while it's called Mount Seir, there is no one particular mountain that is this mountain. That it's more of a hill country that is known as Seir. And again, it is some distance away from the land of Canaan. To get there, you've really got to take a very roundabout route, upwards of 70 miles, coming from places like Jerusalem, if you wanted to get to the land of Edom. Now, interestingly, the word Edom is also a wordplay. Remember how we saw at the beginning of this lecture, Edom trades his birthright for a meal of red stew. Edom is the name red. And so, in many ways, this red concept will come to symbolize a lot of aspects about the Edomites and their land. So, that was the origins of the Edomites. But as we know, that this class is interested in who are the Edomites throughout the course of biblical history. So let's take just a quick moment here and let's look at the history of the Edomites after the book of Genesis. Now, the earliest sources that we have come from Egypt and from Mesopotamia. And to be honest, they say very little about the people living in the land of Egypt. The Egyptians know they are there, and they are trading with them, but for the most part, the Egyptians recognize that they are a nomadic group. And part of the records have trouble distinguishing whether they are a single nomadic group or more than one. 2, sometimes even 3 nomadic groups are claimed to be living in southern Transjordan before 1300 BC. And so it's really difficult to say with any real degree of certainty which one of these groups are directly descended from Esau or not. What we do know, though, is that after 1300 BC, we start to see signs of a distinct Edomite culture living south of the Wadi Zered. We're going to start to see settlements, although fairly small. They will be settlements, and that there will be a distinct Edomite culture that will emerge at the start of the Iron Age. And so all of this is to say that it's very hard to prove archaeologically anything before 1300 about the Edomites. Now, the book of Genesis suggests that the Edomites have been there and active since about 2000 BC, give or take. But we don't really have a lot of proof of the cities they're building, their language, their culture, until after 1300 BC. And because we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence, what this means is that most reconstructions of Edomite history will depend heavily on the Bible. Now, while this is an acceptable tactic for us who are Christians who tend to believe the Bible, that many who are scholars of history who have a certain amount of skepticism with the Bible will note that this means we know very little about Edom's history, simply because if all you know comes from the Bible, that's not a lot to go on if you wish to discredit that as a historical source. But as we've noted, this is a Bible-believing school. We are a Bible-believing people, and so most of what we can glean from Edom's history is that there are periods of rebellion, there are periods of warfare between the Edomites and the kingdoms of Israel. And these will start somewhere around 990 BC, when King David will be described in 2 Samuel 8, verses 13 through 14, as being the first king to successfully conquer the land of Edom. And he will make them vassals, meaning that Edom will have to pay either money or food products to David and his kingdom every year. And in return, they won't be attacked again. And this seems like this is the standard status quo for Edom all the way up through the time of King Solomon, that David will have conquered them, and then from that time on they will be a vassal state until the time of Solomon. Now, specifically, that is going to last till about 854 BC, where during the time of King Jehoram, Edom will finally gain their independence. 2 Kings chapter 8 verses 20 through 22 reads it this way. During his reign, that is Jehoram's reign, Edom freed themselves from Judah's control, and they set up their own king. And so Edom has remained free from Judah's control until this very day. And so what this will mean is that from 854 BC all the way until the time of the fall of the Second Temple in 586 BC, Edom is going to be an independent nation, and one that is going to be able to successfully defend itself and even from time to time antagonize the land of Judah. Now, starting around 780, many Assyrian kings are going to get Assyria's act together. They are going to unite the major Assyrian cities of Ashur, Nineveh, and so forth, and they will become a militaristic juggernaut. And we know from Assyria's records that the Edomites will pay their tribute as conquered subjects to Assyria regularly. And what this will mean is that as long as the Edomites are paying their tribute to Assyria, Assyria will leave them alone. And one of the benefits is that because Edom is paying their tribute and they're being left alone, but the land of Judah did not pay tribute and thus had to deal with the Assyrian war machine, especially in the saddle of Benjamin and in northern areas of Judah, the Edomites are going to have pretty much free reign to start moving down across the Arava and the Jordan River Valley, and they will start settling in the land of the Negev. So by the year 701 BC, while the Assyrians are crippling Judah's military capabilities, the Edomites are moving into the land of the Negev, and for the most part, they will have set up shop by the late 700s, early 600s. And what this will mean is that whenever Jerusalem is being attacked, they will have the Edomites to the south, who are still holding some old and rather painful grudges, and that the Edomites, while they won't attack directly, will be inclined to try to show their support for places attacking the city of Jerusalem. Now, here's where Edom is going to play their dirtiest hand, as it were, in the biblical account. In 586 BC, the Babylonians will finally get through and conquer the city of Jerusalem, something the Assyrians had not been able to do. And as we've seen, the Edomites are already living to the south of Jerusalem. And so if you conquer Jerusalem coming from the north, people escaping are going to naturally run south. And what's going to happen is the Edomites are basically there lying in wait, and when Jerusalem refugees come running south, that the Edomites are going to capture them. They're going to sell many of them into slavery or just kill them outright. The book of Obadiah reads it like this. It says, quote, "You stood aloof while strangers took his army captive and foreigners advanced in his gates. You should not have stood at the fork of the road to slaughter those who were trying to escape, and you should not have captured the refugees and then when they suffered adversity." And so what this is going to mean is that the Edomites are going to successfully help the Babylonians conquer Jerusalem. And this is going to largely leave them free reign all throughout the Negev and southern Levant. But interestingly, future kings of Babylon, for example, Nabonidus, who ruled between 555 BC and 539 BC, he is going to realize that the Edomites are getting a little too powerful for his comfort. And so, sometime during his reign, Nabonidus is going to invade Mount Seir. And what that's going to mean is that the ancestral homeland of the Edomites, the rocky high place up on the Transjordan side of the map, is going to be conquered by the Babylonians. And so the Edomites are really going to kind of be relocated onto the west side, or the Cisjordan side of the map from this point onward. And so again, the result of all this, because now the Edomites' homeland has now been decimated by the Babylonians, a new group is going to move in to the Edomite homeland, and this group is known as the Nabateans, and this is an Arab or an Arabian group. And they're going to take residence on the highlands of Edom. And this is going to be the culture that is responsible for many of the locations of Edom that we would think of today, places like Petra, that these are going to be carved out by the Arabian traders or the Nabateans living here. And so you may ask, well, what happened to the Edomites? Well, after 539 BC, the Jewish people are going to come back to Jerusalem. They are going to rebuild the wall. And part of the reason they may be rebuilding the wall is because, well, quite frankly, they're afraid of people groups like the Edomites are living now just a little too close for comfort. And so there's going to be occasional skirmishes back and forth between the Jewish people and the Edomites all the way up until about 145 BC, when the Jewish people are going to have a high priest by the name of John Hyrcanus. And Hyrcanus is going to be a fairly successful military presence for the Jewish people, so much so that he will take the title king as well. And Hyrcanus is going to subdue the Edomites? Well, technically he's going to subdue the Idumeans. You see, in the meantime, we are now in the intertestamental period. The Greeks are going to come into the Levant, and they're going to largely have conquered the Jewish people. And they're going to start renaming places Greek names. And so the Edomites are going to be referred to as Idumeans in every Greek text that you find. And so if you see someone talking about the Idumeans, they're the same as the Edomites. But what's going to be the final state of the Edomites? Well, after John Hyrcanus, the Edomites will be subdued officially, and they will be forced to be circumcised. And what this is going to mean is that the Edomites, after this point, are going to be treated very much like the Samaritans, kind of like quasi-Jewish people. They will follow the law of Moses, they will circumcise their children, but they will never be given the status or respect of a full-blooded Israelite. Alrighty there, so now that you've got all that under your belt, let's shift gears here just a bit and let's talk about the religion of the Edomites. Now, we don't know all that much about Edomite religion, but we've been able to piece a few things together. For example, in Josephus, in his book Antiquities, he describes that the primary god of the Edomites, or the Idumeans, is a god known as Kus, or Kus. And we have a lot of support for this in some of the documents that have been unearthed in Edomite territory. We find that people are named with this name Kus stuck in the middle of their name. And this is what is known as a theophanic name, where your name, if you translated it, would mean something about your deity. So, for example, if the person was named, if you translated it literally like, Kus is my savior, or Kus makes me strong, that those would be examples of theophanic names. And we see this in a lot of the texts that have been unearthed about Edomites, that their names reflect positively on this name, Kus. And so as best we can tell, Kus is the high god of the Edomite pantheon. And this brings up an interesting problem because unlike all of Israel's other neighbors, the Edomite religion is never directly condemned in the Bible. That there's no prohibition calling Edom's gods detestable or abominations. Quite frankly, it's very silent about Edomite religion. And so what this will mean is that in, for example, Deuteronomy 23 verse 8, there will be a plan that allows the Edomites to join Israelite society after 3 generations of interbreeding, meaning that an Edomite is given a relatively short probation period of 3 generations before their children can be considered good quality Israelites. And other texts, such as the Song of Deborah in Judges 5 verse 4, shows that there is a association with Mount Seir and Yahweh, Israel's God. And so there may at least have been some kind of a syncretistic possibility that the Edomites, in addition to Kus and who knows how many other gods, also tried to worship Yahweh. Now, however, this relatively lax stance on the Edomites becoming Israelites doesn't necessarily mean that the Edomites are held in high esteem. And to be honest, most of the Edomites that we see in the biblical text are fairly disobedient to God's law. For example, in 1 Samuel 21 verse 7, we see Doeg, who apparently has access to the Israelite shrine of worship at a place called Nob, that he is able to overhear talking between David and some of the priests. So we know that Doeg is at least permitted into Israelite worship areas. But he is then going to rat out these priests. He's going to tell Saul what David is up to. And Saul is going to order Doeg to kill these priests of Nob. And Doeg is going to do so pretty much without any real sense of moral scruples here. And we're going to see another example of this where Elisha is going to be met by a convoy of 3 kings, the king of Judah, the king of Israel, and the king of Edom. And we note that when he meets them in 2 Kings 3 verse 14, that he's basically going to say, look, if it wasn't for the king of Judah being here, the only one of you 3 I respect, I wouldn't talk to you at all or even acknowledge your presence. And what this says to me is that, for the most part, the Edomites, while they are given probably the most respect of any of their neighbors. That respect is highly limited. All right, so that was the Edomites. So now let's travel a little further north on our map, and let's talk about the land of Moab, or Moab. Now, the story of where we get the Moabites from is, well, let's be honest, it's pretty gross. I wouldn't call it a pretty story by any stretch, but it goes like this. After Lot and his 2 daughters escape from the town of Sodom, after God blows it up in Genesis 19, that they begin living in a cave. And the daughters are going to start plotting amongst themselves that they won't be able to get a husband in the normal way. That their father is basically choosing to live a distant life away from society after seeing this town of Sodom destroyed. And they concoct a plan to get their father really, really drunk and thus get pregnant through their father. And we see this happen twice, that Lot has 2 daughters, and each one will get pregnant by their father. And the first of these pregnancies, she names the son Moab, and he will be known as the father of the Moabites. So again, we have a people group that is descended from Abraham's bloodline, because Lot is Abraham's nephew. So a close connection to Abraham, but not anywhere near as physically close as the Edomites are. Now, part of the reason why I'm setting up the lecture from south to north instead of north to south like I usually do is because, well, the further north you go, the less complimentary the biblical account of these close relatives of Israel becomes. And as you could probably tell, if the origins of the Moabites are somewhat suspect, i.e. that it required incest with their father, most of the other stories about the Moabites are also going to look pretty ugly. And the first of these ugly accounts is that as Israel is coming into the Promised Land, the people of Moab are going to hear all of the horror stories that here's the people group that basically socked it to Egypt, and they've been socking it to groups like the Amalekites all the way from Sinai. And so the Moabites are going to be gripped with fear, but they've heard of a prophet who may be able to help them, a certain guy named Balaam, the son of Beor, who lives up near the Euphrates River. And so the king of the Moabites, a man by the name of Balak, is going to get the bright idea that if he can just get Balaam to come down to Moab and curse the Israelites, then maybe he's got a shot of winning a battle against them. And so he's going to hire Balaam, and he's going to promise Balaam all kinds of money and riches if he will just simply curse the Israelites. Well, Balaam, of course, doesn't really want to do this. We find lots of examples of, for example, he tells Balak that, I can't say anything that the Lord doesn't give me to say. And, and then on the ride down, his donkey is pretty much going to try to talk him out of going. Well, he does finally reach Balak, and something interesting is going to happen. Every time Balaam tries to curse the Israelites, as per his agreement, that God is going to give Balaam a different message. And so what's going to end up happening is every time Balaam goes to curse the Israelites, he winds up blessing them instead. And so what's going to happen here is after the third time, Balak's going to start getting very angry at Balaam. And he's going to say, look, I called you here to curse my enemies. Why can't you get this done? Well, notice what's going on here. We've already talked about the idea of magic. Your textbook by Walton notes that in most of the ancient Near East, the people have this idea that magic can be even stronger than the gods. And Balak here seems to be relying on a similar form of magic. He doesn't care where the curse comes from necessarily. He just hopes that it can get the job done. And he thinks that his bank account is able to pay for such a curse. And he's very used to hearing about prophets who basically say, yes, I can get the gods to do what I want because of a superior form of magic. And so one of the things going on in Numbers chapter 22 through 24 is that it's going to show that while many of these kings have this view that magic is something that can control the gods, what we find is that God is in control of the magic users, that all power comes from him, and that even if this prophet wanted to, he can't curse Israel because God has already blessed them. So let's get out of the Pentateuch here and let's go on and talk about the rest of Moabite history from about 1300 BC to about 582 BC. And much like the Edomite problem, we just don't have a lot of archaeological evidence for the Moabites before 1300 BC. So as best we can tell, they're probably living as pastoral nomads. They're probably not building that many cities before the start of the Iron Age. And, of course, this creates somewhat of a historical problem because the Exodus account does picture the land of Moab as being organized enough to be under a king, Balak. And so a lot of, we'll call them liberal scholars, have started to ask the question, well, does this mean that the biblical accounts are a lot later, and they're trying to put what we know about Moab, say in like the 800s, all the way back into the 13 or 1400s. Well, I don't agree with those ideas, and there's two possibilities. One, if the Exodus is really early, like 1446 BC, I would just simply say an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And just because we don't have archaeological evidence doesn't mean that a kingdom isn't there. And, kingship is a very relative term. In many cultures, the king is nothing more than a tribal head. And, it would make sense for Balaam living in the land of Moab to resort to a prophet from outside of his land because he may not actually have the type of organization to have a imperial prophet prophesying at his court. The other possibility, this is if you go with a later date for the Exodus, like 1275 BC, that the Israelites are arriving just as Moab is getting organized. And this is the way K.A. Kitchen argues it. Now, most of the references to Moab after the Exodus are pretty negative. For example, during the period of Judges, there's going to be warfare that erupts from the Moabites, and there's going to be a particularly nasty moment where a very fat king by the name of Eglon takes over and begins to oppress the Israelites. And Judges chapter 3 points out like this. It says, "When the Israelites cried out for help to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer. His name was Ehud, son of Gera, a Benjamite, and he was a left-handed man. And the Israelites sent him to the king Eglon of Moab with their tribute payment. And Ehud made himself a sword. It had 2 edges and was 18 inches long, and he strapped it under his right thigh." And where this ends up going is, of course, that he sneaks in, he gives a quippy little statement that causes him to be left alone with the king of Moab. And the king isn't expecting a left-hander, and so he draws the sword where he doesn't expect it, and he is able to stab Moab to death. And of course, then Ehud will make a daring escape, basically through the king's sewer system. And just kind of note this, that most of the battle references to the Moabites tend to portray them in the ugliest terms possible. That people like Eglon are described as very fat, that other Moabite kings are described as getting involved in some very detestable practices. And the point being that while the Moabites are technically closely related by blood, that there will be something just almost abominable to the people when it comes to Moab. Now, all of this is important to sum up because, but arguably the most famous of all the Moabites that we read about in Scripture is Ruth. In fact, there's an entire book named after her. And to summarize the story, Ruth is a female Moabite who has married an Israelite man, but her husband dies. And so Ruth and her mother-in-law will choose to come back to Israel, and Ruth is going to begin living like an Israelite. She will follow Israelite laws. She will do things an Israelite way. And because of this, she will be rewarded. And many of us who read the text today tend to read it for the love story. You know, it's one of those nice, sweet things where we see a good man and a good woman get hooked up together. And in the background, there's also the God's provision of this, that God makes sure that this widow is taken care of. Both her and Naomi live happily ever after, as it were. But reading between the lines of the text, it's also good to note how the text ends. That Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David. And this will pose ourselves a little bit of a problem. You see, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, we are told that no one with Moabite blood is allowed to become officially an Israelite for 10 generations. And what this is going to mean is that Ruth and her son and his son and all the way up to David have got Moabite blood floating around in there. And this is going to ask a very interesting question. How can David be king? How can David even be considered an Israelite? How can David worship the Lord if he has Moabite blood running through him? And the book of Ruth offers a very interesting apology or a defense for this. That Ruth, though she is of Moabite blood, is an Israelite not by blood, but by faith. So it's at this point with the reign of King David that we start to see a little bit of overlap with the Edomites, that David will successfully be able to conquer both the Edomites and the Moabites according to 2 Samuel chapter 8. And David is going to also reduce the Moabites to a vassal state. So long as they are paying him tribute, David will not invade their territory and pillage it. And I find it interesting that David will have temporary alliances with the Moabites. For example, in 1 Samuel 22, it says this, "Then David went from there to Mizpah in Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, 'Please let my father and my mother stay with you until I know what God is going to do for me.' And so he had them stay with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him the whole time that David was in his stronghold. And so what this tells me is that while David will fight the Moabites, that he's also not necessarily on bad relations with them, that they do have blood ties. And, you know, desperate times often call for desperate measures. And while David is fighting Saul, he makes very friendly alliances with the Moabites. He'll also make some very friendly alliances with the Philistines. However, when David is solely in charge, he will definitely take a much more militaristic attitude to these traditional enemies of Israel. Now, around the year 830 BC, we finally have a major artifact that was unearthed here a while ago called the Mesha stela. And this is a large inscription by a Moabite king by the name of Mesha. And this is fairly interesting for us as Bible scholars because King Mesha is also recorded in the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 3. That Mesha will go to war to try to gain independence for the land of Moab from the king Jehoram, who is the grandson of Omri. And the Mesha stela specifically mentions the rebellion of Mesha, and it also mentions that he goes to war against Omri. And so this is a fairly substantial piece of archaeological evidence because it confirms that at least this particular portion of the biblical text is true. Now, 2 Kings chapter 3 puts the rebellion this way. It says, quote, "Now the king of Mesha of Moab was a sheep breeder, and he would send his tribute to the king of Israel of 100,000 male lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. Now when Ahab died and the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel, when the king of Moab realized that he was losing the battle," this is now to the end of the verse, it says that he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and he offered him as a burnt sacrifice upon the wall. And this will bring us to the problem of Moabite religion. You see, unlike the Edomites, Moabite religion is very strongly condemned in the Old Testament. As far as we can tell, the primary god of the Moabites was a god called Chemosh or Chemosh. And the worship of Chemosh is strictly forbidden by the monarchy age prophets. For example, in 1 Kings chapter 11, Chemosh is described as an abomination that Solomon gets tempted into worshiping because he marries a Moabite wife. And it's hard to say what exactly was abominable about this god. A lot of people point to the reference in 2 Kings chapter 3 that the king of Moab does offer his son as a burnt sacrifice, and that if it is offered to Chemosh, that maybe Chemosh has a lot of death god qualities, somewhat like Mot of the Canaanites. Another possibility is that Chemosh is a fertility god, somewhat like Baal, and in which case sex magical rites may also be affiliated with this god. We don't know exactly what was abominable, but we do know that the Bible is consistent, that the Bible calls the worship of this deity a detestable practice. And this will bring us up to our second issue, that most frequently in the Bible, it talks about the dangers of marrying Moabite women. For example, in Numbers chapter 25, it describes how the women of Moab began to entice the Israelite people into performing sex magical rites with a version of Baal called Baal Peor. And in 1 Kings chapter 11, we already talked about how Solomon will build a shrine to Chemosh on the Mountain of Olives because his Moabite wife will ask him to. And then later in the book of Nehemiah, we'll see that there's going to be numerous moves to get people of mixed race out of the Jewish bloodline, and they'll specifically single out Moabites that were excommunicated. And this will all come down to Deuteronomy 23 verse 8, which says that you're not allowed to have a Moabite enter into the sanctuary of the Lord for more than 10 generations. And as we've already looked at, this poses a very big problem because Ruth is our notable exception to this rule, that Moabite women are bad news. All right, so you all still with me? We got 2 down, we got 1 more to go, and that's the Ammonites. This is our third Transjordan group of people, and like the Moabites, the biblical text is keen to note that the Ammonites are also descended from Abraham's nephew, Lot, and that this is an incestuous relationship, that Lot has 2 daughters, and that his 2 sons, Moab and Ben-Ami, also Amin, are the progeny of this unbiblical relationship. And this has caused many biblical scholars to ask the question, is this a historically reliable account? Now, as a conservative, I take that it is a historically accurate view. But you will find from time to time that many liberals will say, no, Israel just hated the Ammonites, and this was a convenient story to basically say, here's why we can go to war with them, that they are the product of this incestuous relationship. So just kind of be on the lookout for that it's an easy way to judge what kind of a commentary you're reading in the book of Genesis, is to ask the question, what do they do with this account of Lot and his relationship with his daughters? So now, before we go on too much further, though, the name Ammonite actually could pose a little bit of a problem. You see, for us English speakers, there are 3 people groups that sound very, very remarkably similar. The Amalekites, the Amorites, and the Ammonites. And so I want to just spend a quick moment to tell the differences between those, and I'd like for you to know those differences. The Amalekites are a Bedouin people group. They live down near the Sinai Peninsula and the southern Negev, according to Numbers 13, verse 29. And that this is a group that is placed under the ban, that they are to be treated like Canaanites, specifically because they attacked Israel during the Exodus, that their people basically went behind the Israelite lines and picked off stragglers that were falling behind from the group. And so what's going to happen is that once we get to the time of King Saul, that specifically the prophet Samuel will tell Saul that, for 400 years, God has sat on this judgment, but now it is time to judge the Amalekite people. Now Saul will carry out this command, but he will not carry it out completely. He will leave many of the sheep and cattle as well as the king of the Amalekites alive. And because of this, there will be large-scale repercussions for his kingdom, notably that he will have the kingdom ripped away from him because he fails to carry out this command to the Lord's specifications. So now, the second people group we need to distinguish is the Amorites. The Amorites are a people group that are, technically they're a form of Canaanite, that they live in the mountainous regions on both the east and the west side of the Jordan River, according to Numbers 13:29. And so, like the Canaanites, they are in the list of 7 people groups that are under the ban, that they are to be eradicated from the promised land once the Israelites come into it. Now, of particular note, though, that the Ammonites play a major part of the settlement of the eastern side of the Jordan River. That as Israel is coming into the promised land, they'll come to the land of Edom, but because Edom's territory has been made safe because of God's command, they'll go around. Same with Moab. They come to Moab, but they'll go around Moab because God has given that land to the Moabites. But then they'll cross the Wadi Arnon, and they'll get to the town of Heshbon, and they'll meet a king named Shihon, who is an Amorite king. And this Amorite king is going to refuse them passage, but in addition to that, he's also going to say that I'm going to bring my army out and we're going to fight the Israelites. Well, according to the biblical text, the Lord will hand the Amorites over to the people of Israel, and they will eradicate Shihon and his people, basically treating them like they will treat the Canaanites on the western side of the Jordan River. And this, of course, is why there are 3 tribes, the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh that is dwelling on the east side of the Jordan River, or the Transjordan side, because the Amorites have been displaced during this fight. And this is also going to set the table for a future problem, not with the Amorites, but with the closely related, or at least the closely situated Ammonites. So, as we pointed out, the Ammonites are the ones who are descended from Lot, i.e. Abraham's nephew. And their territorial area that they control is near what is known as the Wadi Yavok. And the problem is that they consider their lands to go all the way from the Wadi Yavok all the way down to the Wadi Arnon. So at least as far as the Ammonites is concerned, they controlled the area that Israel will take over from the Amorites. And of course, this is going to cause several conflicts. Probably the biggest one comes up in Judges 11, 1 through 29 with Jephthah, that the Ammonites will say, when you guys came in, you conquered our southern territories. And of course, the Israelite pushback is going to be, no, we didn't. We conquered the land of the Amorites. And so many scholars have kind of questioned just how do you tell the difference between an Amorite and an Ammonite? Now, in Hebrew, it is a lot more easy to tell the difference, that while they look very similar in English, that they're spelled very differently in Hebrew. But that being said, that there still seems to be a lot of overlap, that the Ammonites, the children who are descended from Lot, seem to consider the land of the Amorites their territory as well. So that was the early history of the Ammonites, but they will also play a fairly significant role in later accounts of Israel's kings as well. For example, in 1 Samuel 11, the king Saul has just recently been appointed to be the leader of the Israelite people. That they've asked for a king, Samuel has finally capitulated to that demand, and the first real test of Saul's resolve is going to be an Ammonite king by the name of Nahash. Now, Nahash is going to try to extend the Ammonite territory past the boundaries of the Wadi Yavok, and he's specifically going to try to start taking over places in the land of Gilead to the north. And he is going to specifically tell the people of Gilead, yes, you can make a peace treaty with me, but you're going to pay for that peace treaty. You're going to let me gouge out your right eye so that everyone who sees you is going to know that you've been utterly trounced and humiliated by the Ammonites. It's at this point that Saul is going to kick into high gear. He is going to rally the Israelite forces to come to the aid of Gilead, and through the Lord's help, they're going to defeat Nahash. Now, I do find it interesting that Nahash, while he is defeated, is not going to be removed from power, and we know this because of what we see a little bit later, that David, when he is on the run from Saul, is going to begin basically soliciting allies wherever he can find it. We know that he goes over and hides his parents with the Moabites. We know he goes down to the Philistines and seeks refuge in one of their cities called Ziklag. Well, when David comes to power as king in his own right, he remembers King Nahash, and he remembers him rather fondly that Nahash gave him support against Saul. And I would like to point this out, that this is what makes the relationship with all of Israel's Transjordan neighbors complicated. That they will fight, they will have some even very brutal and vicious battles, but at the same time, when there is a common enemy, for example, Nahash doesn't like Saul, David is on the run from Saul, that difficult situations can often make weird bedfellows in spite of theological differences. Now, when it comes to the arrival of the Babylonians, that the Ammonites are also going to do what the Edomites did, that they're going to start taking advantage of Israel's inability to fight and maintain their possessions. Now, as we looked at earlier, the Edomites will go down into the Negev and will start to control the lower parts of our Levant map. But the Ammonites are going to finally do what they've always wanted to do, and they're going to start conquering the northern areas of Gilead. And they're going to do so because the land of Israel has already been deported by the Assyrians, and the people of Judah are going to be too busy fighting the Babylonians to really stop the Ammonites from doing this. And we see this near the end of Jeremiah's ministry. In, for example, Jeremiah chapter 49, he says this, "Concerning the sons of Ammon, this is what the Lord says. Does Israel have no sons, or has he no heirs? Then why has Malcham, who is one of the Ammonite gods, taken possession of Gad, and his people settled in their cities?" And so what we're going to see is that the Ammonites are going to start controlling basically the whole area from the Wadi Yavok up into Gilead and then down all the way to the Wadi Arnon. But unlike the Edomites and like the Moabites, the Ammonites are not going to survive the onslaught of the Babylonian military juggernaut. Once Babylon is done with the land of Judah and has deported Judah, they're going to set their sights east across the Jordan. And the Babylonians are going to systematically take out the Ammonites, the Moabites, and even the Edomites in their homeland of Mount Seir. And the Ammonites are really going to be the first to fall. According to Josephus in Antiquities, book 10, verse 9, or chapter 9, verses 3 through 4, by 582, the Babylonians are going to just steamroller both the Ammonites and the Moabites, and they will send them into exile as well. And because of this, Ammonite history really ends around 582 BC. Now, that doesn't mean that the land is going to be desolate, but what it's going to mean is that there's going to be new people groups coming in and out. And so one of the things we're going to find is that Ammonite territory is going to, especially with the arrival of the Greeks, start to become kind of a Greek colony. And before long, they're going to start calling it the Decapolis area, or the area of the 10 cities. And this is a very Greek name, Deca, 10, Polis, cities. And so just keep in mind that while this is the traditional area of the Ammonites in the Old Testament, it is going to be a Greek pagan area in the time of the New Testament. So one final gear shift here, and let's talk about the Ammonite religion. I'd like to point out that, like the Moabites, the Ammonite religion is strongly condemned as detestable. Of Solomon's many wives, for example, in 1 Kings 11, verse 5, we find out that he builds an altar in Jerusalem to the chief god of the Ammonites, who's known as Milcom. Now, like the Moabite god Shamash, we don't really know a lot about Milcom. We just don't have the text like we have of Baal explaining what the worship of Milcom looked like. Now, it is a Semitic name, and it comes from the root Mem Lamek Kaf, which is the word for king. And so it may just simply be a designation of this god is our king. And it is unclear, like with Shamash, what made the worship of Milcom so heinous. And there's two prominent theories. The first is that, like the god Molech, Milcom is a death deity, and so if you were in trouble and you needed to pacify this deity, you had to perform a human sacrifice. And so a lot of the rabbinic writings talk about Milcom as being this god that was basically a metal idol that you would heat up like a furnace, and then you would place a child or a human being in the arms of Milcom, and that it would incinerate the child as a form of sacrifice. That is often what they refer to as passing through the fire. And it's possible that that's what this means. There's also a second possibility that, like the god Baal, Milcom may have been a fertility deity. And in that case, we may have been having a lot of sex magic rites being attributed to Milcom as well. And again, this is one of those cases where we just don't have the textual evidence to say, what was it about this worship that was so detestable? All we know is that anytime this god comes up, more often than not, it says the detestable god, Milcom. So again, like the Moabites, the Ammonite religion is highly condemned. But we also know a few things that the Ammonites did have in common with the Israelites. And probably the biggest thing is that the Ammonites are going to circumcise their children. And this has raised a couple of really big questions among scholars of just how much influence did the Israelites have over the Ammonites? Did they get this institution of circumcision because they remembered ancestrally that Lot and Abraham worshiped the same God sometime way back when? I'm not sure about that. But we do find an interesting set of quotes in the book of Judges, chapter 11, where the judge Jephthah goes up against the Ammonites, and he makes an interesting claim that the Ammonites are claiming that the Israelites had taken their land, while the Israelites are saying, no, we didn't take your land. We took the Amorite land, not the Ammonite land. And so there's going to be this idea of who had whose land. And I find it interesting that in the book of Judges, Jephthah is specifically going to say that God has given us this land to the south near Heshbon and near the Wadi Arnon, that is our possession, and our God gave it to us. But he says, your God, Milcom, gave you your possessions up by the Wadi Jabbok. And I find this to be an interesting statement, that it shows that not all of the judges would be strongly or even strictly monotheist. That people like Jephthah are willing to acknowledge not only the existence of these Ammonite gods, but also the possibility that their gods had helped them subdue another people group. And so this is going to be the second similarity between the Ammonites and their religion and the Israelites and their religion. Both are going to have a meta-narrative that their God that they worship has helped them to displace the native Canaanite people so that they can have their territory all to themselves. Alrighty, so that's going to conclude our lecture here. Let's try to tie off with two major points here that are take-home points about these three people groups. And the biggest thing is that the Transjordan area of the Levant is home to three major people groups: the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites. And our second major point I want you to know is that these people all shared a close and complicated relationship with Israel. That there's a lot of bad blood between these feuding cousins, as it were, but it's nowhere near the problem of the Canaanites. There's no standing order from God that these people need to be destroyed. And even periodically, as in the case of David, we're going to see alliances. And even every now and then, as in the case of Ruth, we'll see even godly influences coming out from these people. And so what that's going to mean is that while they will be a pagan culture, that they will constitute a militaristic and a syncretistic problem with the Israelites, that they are not put in the same category as the Philistines, the Phoenicians, or the Canaanites. And this will be important to keep in mind as we continue our study, that the Israelites acknowledged different brands of paganism. And while some are bad, some are worse.